Racist cop confronts black judge. What happens next will inspire you. True life story. The tension between Officer Brad Calloway and Judge Elijah Carter was no longer just an isolated moment on the street. What had begun as an unjust traffic stop had turned into something much bigger, something neither of them could escape. The morning after the incident, the city was buzzing. The video of Officer Calloway aggressively stopping Judge Carter had gone viral overnight. News stations picked it up, activists called for accountability, and even the mayor's office released a statement about the city's commitment to fairness in law enforcement. But in the middle of it all, Brad Calloway sat in his police department's break room, staring at his phone. "They're tearing you apart out there, man." His partner, Officer Mike Reynolds, shook his head, saying you racially profiled a judge. Brad scoffed. "I didn't know he was a judge." "That's not the point," Mike said, lowering his voice. "It looks bad. Real bad." Brad clenched his jaw. He had been a cop for over 15 years. He wasn't some rookie making reckless mistakes. But deep down, he couldn't deny that something about that encounter had made him act differently. And now, the world was watching. That afternoon, Brad was summoned to Chief Ramirez's office. He had expected a slap on the wrist, maybe a warning. What he didn't expect was to see Internal Affairs sitting across from him, recording everything he said. "Officer Calloway," the chief said, rubbing his temples. "You've put us in a difficult position." Brad straightened. "I was doing my job." "The guy had a broken taillight." "Right," Chief Ramirez said. "And that's why you told him to get out of the car like he was a criminal?" Brad's mouth went dry. He hadn't realized those words had been recorded. "Do you know who Elijah Carter is?" the chief continued. Brad hesitated. "I do now. He's one of the most respected judges in this city," the chief said. "And whether you meant to or not, you humiliated him in front of his own community. Now, we have protests brewing, activists demanding action, and a case file on my desk that might put you on unpaid leave, if not worse." Brad's fists tightened. "So, that's it? I'm a racist now." "I didn't say that," the chief replied. "But your actions are under investigation." He sighed. "We have two options, Calloway. You can fight this, but given the public pressure, you might not like how that ends. Or," Brad narrowed his eyes. "Or what?" "Or you make things right." Brad frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" The chief leaned forward. "You're going to meet with Judge Carter." Brad's stomach twisted. "You want me to apologize?" "I want you to listen," Chief Ramirez said firmly. "The city doesn't just need damage control. It needs change. And if you don't want to be part of the problem, it's time to start being part of the solution." Brad swallowed hard. He wasn't sure if he hated the idea more because it felt like an admission of guilt, or because deep down, he wasn't sure if he was completely innocent. Meanwhile, Judge Elijah Carter sat in his chambers, staring at the mountain of case files before him. He should have been focusing on work, but his mind kept drifting back to the confrontation. He had spent his entire career trying to change the system from the inside. But that night on the street, none of that had mattered. He had been just another black man with a cop's gun in his face. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. His longtime friend and law clerk, Denise Walker, peeked inside. "You okay?" she asked. Elijah exhaled. "I don't know. Feels like everything I've worked for just got tossed aside like it meant nothing." Denise stepped in and placed a newspaper on his desk. The headline read, "They want you to press charges," she said softly. Elijah shook his head. "What good would that do? Fire one cop, and another just like him takes his place?" Denise frowned. "So, what are you going to do?" Elijah hesitated. "The police chief called. He wants me to meet with Calloway." Denise's eyebrows shot up. "And you're actually considering it?" "I don't know," Elijah admitted. "Part of me wants to tell him to go to hell. But another part of me," he ran a hand over his face. "Maybe there's an opportunity here." Denise crossed her arms. "An opportunity for what? To be the bigger person?" Elijah shook his head. "To force him to see what I see. To make him understand." Denise studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Just be careful," she warned. "People like him don't change overnight." The next day, Elijah and Brad sat across from each other in a private conference room at the police station. The air was thick with unspoken tension. Brad leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. So, what? You here to lecture me? Elijah kept his expression neutral.
No.
I'm here to ask you a question. Brad frowned. What question? Elijah folded his hands. Do you really believe you treated me the same way you would have treated a white man that night? Brad opened his mouth to respond, but then closed it. He didn't have a good answer. You see, Officer Calloway, Elijah continued, I spent years believing in justice and fairness. But that night, all you saw was a black man in a nice car. You didn't see a judge. You didn't see a father. You didn't see a person. You saw a threat. Brad's jaw tightened. That's not. He stopped himself. He wanted to argue. He wanted to defend himself. But something about the way Judge Carter spoke, calm, direct, without anger, made it harder to fight back. So, Elijah said, tell me, why did you see me as a threat? Brad exhaled sharply. Look, I grew up in the city. I've seen things you wouldn't believe. I've seen good cops get killed because they let their guard down. I've seen crime destroy families. His voice was raw. I don't hate black people, Judge Carter. But I do have my guard up. Elijah studied him. And you don't think I've seen crime? You don't think I've lost people? His voice turned sharp. The difference is, I don't assume every white man I see is dangerous.
Can you say the same about black men?
Brad's silence was the answer. For the first time, he saw the problem from the other side. As the weeks went by, the tension didn't fade overnight. But something shifted. Brad started questioning his own assumptions. He sat in on community meetings listening instead of defending. He read reports about racial profiling not as a cop trying to prove a point, but as a man trying to understand. Elijah, on the other hand, began to see the complexities of the job from Brad's perspective. He sat with officers who told stories of near-death experiences, of losing partners, of making split-second decisions that haunted them forever. Neither man changed completely, but for the first time, they saw each other not as enemies, but as two men trapped in a broken system, both trying to survive. And that, perhaps, was the beginning of real change. Weeks passed, and despite their forced interactions, Officer Brad Calloway and Judge Elijah Carter remained at odds. The community was still on edge, protests continued, and the city awaited the outcome of the internal investigation into Brad's actions. Then, one evening, everything changed. Elijah had just finished a long day in court and was driving home when he noticed something unusual in his rearview mirror, a police cruiser following too closely. His grip on the steering wheel tightened. Not again. As he pulled up to a red light, the patrol car's lights flashed behind him. For a moment, he considered ignoring it. But he knew better. Elijah pulled over. His heart pounded, but he refused to let fear consume him. A shadow approached his window, and to his shock, it wasn't a random cop. It was Brad Calloway. Brad hesitated, then sighed. Judge Carter. Elijah's voice was cold. Is this some kind of sick joke? Brad shook his head. I need to talk to you. Elijah scoffed. You need to talk to me? After everything. I know how this looks, but I swear I'm not here to harass you, Brad said.
Please.
Just hear me out. Something in Brad's tone was different. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't defensiveness. It was urgency. Elijah sighed. You've got 2 minutes. Brad nodded and glanced around before speaking. You know that internal investigation against me? Yes, Elijah said flatly. I assume you're here to complain about it. Brad shook his head.
No.
I'm here because I found something out. Something big. And I think you're in danger. Elijah frowned. What are you talking about? Brad leaned in. This whole situation, your case, my investigation, the protests, it's being manipulated. Elijah raised an eyebrow. By who? Brad hesitated, then said, Captain Reynolds. Elijah's blood ran cold. Mike Reynolds, Brad's longtime partner, had always seemed off to Elijah. He had an air of quiet hostility, the kind of man who didn't need to say much to make you feel unwanted. Elijah narrowed his eyes. What does Reynolds have to do with this? Brad exhaled. He wanted me to make sure you backed down. Backed down from what? Elijah demanded. From investigating police misconduct, Brad admitted. Reynolds and a few other guys, They're involved in some deep corruption. And the night I pulled you over, I wasn't supposed to just give you a hard time. They wanted me to push harder. Elijah's jaw tightened. So you were their pawns? Brad looked ashamed. I didn't realize it at first. But then I started connecting the dots. Elijah shook his head. Why are you telling me this now? Brad's expression darkened. Because Reynolds found out that I've been asking too many questions. And now he's coming after both of us. Before Elijah could process Brad's warning, another set of flashing lights appeared behind them. Brad's face went pale. Damn it. That's them. Elijah turned to see another patrol car pulling up fast. Get in my car, Brad ordered. Elijah hesitated. Are you serious? Do you trust me or not? Brad snapped. Elijah clenched his jaw. He didn't trust Brad, but he trusted Reynolds even less. Brad jumped into the driver's seat, and Elijah reluctantly got into the passenger side. The moment he slammed the door shut, Brad floored it. Behind them, the second police car followed in pursuit. Elijah's heart pounded as the city blurred past. Where are we going? Somewhere safe, Brad said, gripping the wheel. I have proof, documents, recordings. We need to get to someone who can help. Elijah's mind raced. This wasn't just about an unfair traffic stop anymore. It was bigger, much bigger. As Brad sped through the city, the radio crackled to life. Calloway, a voice sneered. You're making a mistake. Brad cursed. They patched into my radio. Elijah grabbed it. Reynolds, if you're listening, you're finished. Reynolds chuckled darkly. You think so, Your Honors? A loud pop shattered the air. The rear windshield exploded. They're shooting at us? Elijah shouted. Brad gritted his teeth. They'd rather silence us than let this get out. He swerved onto a side street, trying to lose them. The city lights flickered as they raced through the dark, sirens wailing behind them. Then, up ahead, a blockade. Brad slammed the brakes. We're trapped, Elijah muttered. Brad's hands tightened on the wheel.
No.
We fight back. The doors of the second patrol car opened. 4 officers stepped out. Reynolds stood in front, gun drawn. Step out of the car, Calloway, he ordered. Brad turned to Elijah. You still got that legal fire in you? Elijah exhaled sharply. You have the proof? Brad nodded. In the glove compartment, Elijah grabbed the flash drive. Then let's make this count. They stepped out, hands raised. Reynolds smirked. Smart move. Elijah spoke first. You know this is being recorded, right? The dash cams, the body cams, your career is over. Reynolds' smirk faltered. You shoot us, and this whole city will burn, Elijah continued. The other officers exchanged glances. Brad took a step forward. It's over, Mike. Reynolds' hand shook. For the first time, doubt flickered in his eyes. Then more sirens. Reinforcements. Reynolds' face twisted with rage. He lunged, bang, a gunshot rang through the air. Reynolds fell. One of the arriving officers had fired. Silence. Then, shouting. Officers rushed forward, handcuffing the corrupt cops while paramedics tended to the wounded. Brad and Elijah locked eyes. It was over. Days later, Elijah stood before a packed courtroom. Reynolds and the corrupt officers were on trial, facing charges that could put them away for decades. Elijah turned to see Brad, sitting in the audience, no longer a cop, but something more. A man who had finally seen the truth. And for the first time, he nodded in respect. Because change wasn't about one moment. It was about what came next. The courtroom was packed, buzzing with anticipation. It had been weeks since the dramatic standoff that exposed Captain Mike Reynolds and his web of corruption, and now, the day of reckoning had finally arrived. Judge Elijah Carter sat at the bench, maintaining his usual composure, though his heart felt heavier than usual. This case was different. This wasn't just about law, it was about justice in its rawest form. Across from him, Reynolds and the officers who had conspired with him sat in orange jumpsuits, their heads lowered as the prosecution detailed their crimes: abuse of power, evidence tampering, conspiracy, and attempted murder. The testimonies had been damning. Brad Calloway's voice had been one of the most powerful. I was one of them, he had admitted in court, his voice steady, but filled with remorse. I believed what they told me. I followed orders. But when I saw how deep the corruption ran, when I saw that the people I swore to protect were actually the ones I was hurting, I knew I had to make a choice. Elijah had watched as Brad told the truth, exposing the system he had once defended. It was a rare moment, a white cop standing against his own, knowing the consequences, knowing that redemption wouldn't come easy. And yet, as Elijah watched the jury deliver its verdict, guilty, he realized that maybe, just maybe, real change had begun. The news spread like wildfire. Headlines read, Small Blue Diamond corrupt officers exposed in landmark case, Small Blue Diamond Judge Carter and former Officer Calloway bring justice to the city's Small Blue Diamond. Will this be the start of police reform? Some celebrated. Others resisted. The protests outside the courthouse didn't stop. If anything, they grew louder. But this time, the message was different. It wasn't just anger. It was hope. Hope that the system could change. Hope that those in power could be held accountable. Hope that men like Elijah and even Brad could stand together, not as enemies, but as allies. Despite his testimony, Brad wasn't free from consequences. The department had cut ties with him, branding him a traitor. Many officers refused to speak to him. Some even called him worse names than they had ever called Elijah. But Brad didn't regret his decision. You knew what you were risking, Elijah said as they sat on a bench outside the courthouse after the trial. Brad exhaled, watching the crowd of protesters in the distance.
Yeah.
But I finally did the right thing. Elijah studied him. What will you do now? Brad shrugged. Not sure. I lost my job. I lost a lot of people I thought were my friends. But I don't want to be that guy anymore. Elijah hesitated, then said, the city could use more people willing to fix the system from the inside. Brad glanced at him. Are you saying what I think you're saying? Elijah smirked. There are other ways to serve justice, Brad. And I think you'd be good at them. Brad chuckled. Are you offering me a job, your honors? Elijah stood. I'm saying you should consider going to law school. Brad's smile faded, replaced by something deeper. Understanding. He had spent his life enforcing laws he barely understood. Maybe now he could learn how to uphold them the right way. A letter that changed everything. Days later, Elijah sat in his office, reflecting on everything that had happened, when his assistant knocked on the door. Judge Carter, this just arrived for you. She handed him an envelope. No return address. Just his name. Elijah opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter. Judge Carter, I never thought I'd say this, but I owe you my life. Not just because you didn't let me get killed that night, but because you showed me something I never saw before. The truth. I spent years justifying what I was doing, pretending I was upholding the law, when I was really just upholding a system that hurt people like you. And I see that now. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect anything. But I wanted you to know that I'm trying. I start law school next semester. And I promise, I won't be the same man I was. Brad Calloway. Elijah leaned back in his chair, staring at the letter. It wasn't about winning or proving a point.
It was about change.
And maybe, just maybe, change had begun months past. Brad started his classes, struggling but determined. Elijah continued his work, knowing that there were still battles to fight. The city still had its problems. The system was still flawed. But there was hope. Hope that justice wasn't just a word. Hope that even those who had been on the wrong side could find their way back. Hope that one moment, one case, one choice could make all the difference. And as Elijah stepped into his courtroom once more, he knew that this was only the beginning. Justice wasn't just about laws, it was about people, and people could change.